golden moment, the presentation of the day. I'm very excited to announce Resultant's data governance expert, Paola Saibene, on governing your data evolved by design. So Paola has a rather extensive education at the master's degree level in information security, digital risk management, and data science. She works with the C-suite roles for clients and has mentored not just hundreds, but thousands of individuals to fulfill critical business missions in key verticals, including areas such as healthcare, finance, manufacturing, biotech, pharma, transportation, government, the list goes on and on. While Paola currently works in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, a fun fact is that she lived for many years in Hawaii and learned about the 13 military bases as well as the 34 neighboring countries across the water. So a quick note to the audience that we will be collecting questions in the chat for Paola that she can answer at the appropriate time. So please log your questions during the presentation as you think of them. So without further ado, welcome Paola to the DBNOG user group, and we are excited about hearing your lessons and ideas about governing your data vault by design.
Thank you so much. It is a real privilege, and I know that the word is sometimes overused, but I really mean it. So thank you for having me here. And let me know, please, Mary, if this looks good. All right. Are you able to see it okay?
It does. It looks good. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. So, folks, I think that I want to start with something that has always worked well for me in terms of governance, and that is that at the granular level, when we apply any kind of governance, whether it is at a field or schema or model level, it's really important to always have the full picture, or as much as we can, regardless of the role that we play in the organization. Why? Because if we don't know the why of governance, then it begins to lose momentum, and we can make it work for a little while, but eventually it becomes unsustainable. One interesting fact is that as far as governance programs go, 85% of governance programs today fail, and they don't fail because they were badly set up. They fail because the strategy did not have enough of that why. So the focus of today's presentation is, for those of you who have been certified already or are working with data vaults, is to expand a little bit more that governance lens and see how you can incorporate it in what you're doing right now. I do also have some elements that are more for the starting folks, but hopefully it's a good blend that can satisfy everyone's curiosity. I want to start with just the basic definition that governance is a term that gets used a lot in the data management world, and it means a little bit different than those that are purely in the governance space. So I start with governance cleanly and in pure form is about rights and decisions on information and data, but it is a business decision that gets applied to the technology, and then that's where the management brings that level of operationalization of that governance. And sometimes we see that mixed. I have borrowed a graph here that shows that over the years how we have changed that data governance perspective, the evolution, and how today it is very much entrenched in strategic alignment, in the culture, in the data lifecycle, end-to-end. In quality, of course, we see that all the time. In risk management practices, I'm working right now with clients where we are embedding that all the way in enterprise risk and operational risk management, and merging the governance of their warehouse in that kind of guideline level and merged, infused approach. The context of the talk today is going to be about looking at the 5 top reasons that I can find today and I can read about in terms of why are people going down the data vault path. You all know this really well. The change that we have upon us in the marketplace and in the organizations and mergers and acquisitions, etc., calls for a faster, more agile approach, as Mary was indicating before. So the vault is a perfect candidate for that. Big data is everywhere. It's getting bigger, exponential, and more complex, especially with blurring more of the physical and digital realms, and then converting all of that into structured and unstructured data, and of course having to interpret that and then rolling it back up into ML and AI interpretations. There is nothing ever perfect, and we have become very accustomed to that agile approach, but we need to make sure that the perfection at least lies in the focus and in the value equations that we adopt in order to run the data vault so well that it is never questioned. If anything, more resources and funding and expertise gets thrown at it as a result of how well calibrated it is. So governance from this approach is looked upon as a calibration process that brings extreme value. And then, of course, the beauty of the vault is that auditability and traceability and historicity that so many in the risk space are coveting. And we'll see a little bit later on in the slides how in the very complex data privacy world of today, and e-discovery is something that comes that is so important. I want to stop here first before we go down the pure governance path and back to the why of this. This is a value equation from Gartner. And as a data vault practitioner, or even as an enabler of for the vendors listening as well, where does your practice lie today? Do you know exactly where you fall? Are you in the box of fulfilling the priorities and the concerns of some stakeholders of the organization? Are you purely in the back end as an enabler? And I think many data vault experts and specialists are seeing themselves in that space. Or are you considering moving towards the right-hand side, which is on a multi-stakeholder impact, which requires that you understand a whole lot more about those business goals? And then at the bottom right, that realized return to the organization. And this is where the really good calculations on ROI and ROV take place. And this is where we can quantify the need for sustaining and creating more adoption for data vaults and bringing more people to understand it and use it and equip those that are in place. So just a question for you folks as to where do you think you fall in this space. The life cycle of data, as you all know, is really important, but we get to see that life cycle sometimes represented in a manner that's a bit static. I like to bring it down to a really simple way of talking about it so that we can talk to every stakeholder about it. And why is this important to a vault? It is important because as it pertains to what you're holding, whether in a raw state or in the business rules area, what you're holding needs to be have gone through certain certification processes or vetting processes. Why are we collecting it? Who actually got to touch it before? Who was not allowed to touch it before and can actually see it now in the vault potentially, and in which state? Who gets to modify it and at which point? Where is it reported ultimately? What conclusions are drawn from it and what decisions? Is there any automation in those decisions as it goes? Does the meaning of a field change from unit to unit, get recorded, and where is that? Is there one central repository for all? How does it connect? Of course, within the vault is easy to explain, but how does it connect outside of it? And are there repercussions afterwards once we have connected them through satellite or links, etc.? And do vendors get to get their hands on it, whether inside the vault or outside? And what are the repercussions there? Finally, how healthy is it overall? Can we quantify that as it goes? I know we get it in the raw state, we get it as is, and we don't really care about it from a technical perspective. But I think the day is coming in which we need to be able to put a score as to how that arrives, so that we can also quantify how it gets modified and how it comes out. And how do we dispose of it eventually? So these are basic questions that the business and the technical teams together have to be able to walk away with, and it's a basic governance conversation. I borrowed this from the UK folks that I liked their extended data vault framework, and I liked how they have everything from sources all the way to consumption. We're going to blow up this a little bit more as we go on in the next few slides, but they have, of course, governance going across these areas, rightly so. And their explanation as to how it affects the quality, clear definitions, They have a whole framework analysis, and it behooves me to just focus on things that are not easily found on the internet for you, so that I'm not repeating something that you can easily find yourself. But I'm going to add to these disciplines in audit and metadata, specifically on the industries and how that is now creating more complications for governance. Along those complications is I keep on seeing in the data management world the word records referred in a manner that is actually different from how you would refer to it in other industries. So let's take the financial industry, for instance. A record is not necessarily something that is digital. It could be physical as well, but a record is something that has a different kind of care that is needed to be placed upon it, because it involves a business transaction of some sort, which has a legally binding quality to it. So it could be a very apparently unimportant data set, but if that data set conforms to a record, what is legally considered that way, and in the banking industry, most of that data is indeed a record, then now we have to treat it in a different manner, and we have to dispose of it by law in a different way. And there are certain auditing standards that we need to be mindful of. So why is this important in a vault? Well, because there are potentially, unless you're using only views for looking at the data, and you continue to look at views as you are date stamping them, if you will. If you have raw data for the sake of doing great data science work, and you are piling on those tables for a period of time, and they go above and beyond what the records management by state, by the way, is this not just federal, but by state, you need to know how the nuances of those are. Then now we're in violation of something that maybe the folks at the business level did not realize, that there was a vault in place with these copies for a good purpose, but there was no conversation in terms of governance as to when they should have been purged. More on that, back in the record space, records get classified, but records from a legal perspective, they get classified by their importance and their vitality. So a vital record is something that you might have heard in terms of health. And whenever I mention that to data management folks, they think, oh yes, I know what that is. It has to do with health. Well, not quite so in the formal record space. So these are data sets that are associated with crucial operations of the enterprise, of the organization, and they're classified just according to that. So now they have business continuity management and disaster recovery implications. And when there are copies of that in the vault, then now they need to be classified accordingly there, and thereby potentially increasing that business continuity and disaster recovery capabilities or not, but it has to be measured according to that. Before we come down to more details on specific governance, I want to just touch on very briefly on how in the life cycle of data, I tend to see it like a fish. So I know this sounds silly, forgive me for the primitive analogy, but it's a way of explaining how, imagine if you were fishing and you went to waters that you thought was a river, that it was okay, but maybe you needed a license to be able to fish there. And maybe you need to have a particular type of bait. Not every kind of bait is allowed, because then it just disturbs the ecosystem of the waters. Maybe there were times of the year that you were only allowed to be there. What was the water like? What was the cleanliness of that? Do you happen to know? Of course, the fish are not going to consent to be caught, but in the case of data, you would have to get specific consents per state or per geographical location around the world. Permissions, operations, rules, groups, how are we going to use the fish? So we catch it, let's say we catch a lot of it, we take it to the pier. And then the folks in the pier distribute it in the marketplace and they send it to restaurants. Well, as they send it to restaurants, then is it something, how does it get cleansed? Does the person at the pier that is distributing the fish know that certain types are going to end up in fine dining? Or do they know that it's going to end up in fish powder, or just fish meals or soups? So the care that you have for the fish along the way, and how you transport it, and how you, the types of gateways through that is different from maybe we're just going to end up as meal powder. Likewise with the data. And the vault is right in the middle of that. The vault is in the middle of the story. You are right there at the distribution, in a way, slash beginning of use, and maybe distribution slash restaurant, without quite knowing what kind of clientele you're going to get all the time. You know the basics, but you might not know exactly as the months and years go on how that is going to increase, especially with partnerships and especially with M&As. So keeping this story in mind, I'll take you to our governed by design framework, or methodology, I should say. We come from the left-hand side, asking our clients very specifically, what is important and why? And you'd be surprised how most of our clients start with one idea. After a few design thinking sessions, they realize, wow, what I thought I wanted, I don't. And what I didn't think that I needed, I do. Part of that is we start from the bottom. Are you treating it as an asset? Are you treating it as a product? Or are you treating it as a service that has tremendous implications on every single stage of the data lifecycle? Why? Because if you're going to treat it as a service, now you have very different qualifiers and certifications you need to go through for that platform, and for the pipelines that feed that platform, and for the vaults and the warehouses, etc. If you treat it as a product, then it's going to have a dynamic effect. You have an expectation and a ratio of how quickly that the health of that data changes, the kind of investment that you need to place, and all eyes on that metadata. And if you treat it as an asset, then there's a lot more, there's a plethora of approaches there that is folks are more familiar with. But you get to see that in the different, where you place that importance. And this is not something that is sequential. So we can start with individuals that are setting up a vault because they want to improve the data architecture and be agile. And by the way, they were told by the CEO that they're going to be putting a lot of AI in place. So there's a connection here on how the governance needs to work for them between how the vault is set up and the AI that is coming around the corner, or ML in place. Maybe that data is going to be sold in terms of shared through partners, or actually sold in the marketplace. Maybe the reason why the vault is in place is because they have not really been able to keep up with the legality or the intellectual property, or et cetera, et cetera. And we'll revisit this as we move towards the next few slides. Hopefully this makes sense as we go. So why apply then something like what we have at Technion, which is the governed by design methodologies? Let's consider the 10 best practices for deploying a data vault on Azure Synapse. And I just grabbed 3 of them: the use of views to express interface contracts. And this is something that at governed by design, you would need to know exactly how many, why. I noticed in much of the material that I was reading that there are some, and you know this better than I do since I don't implement vaults, but what is it that would cause a set of engineers to put more views than not, and where that fine line resides? That gets influenced by the business outcome. The version controls, of course, just like in any other project, but version controls under governed by design, we would say, what standards are you using for those version controls? And then the automation. This is very important, as it exponentially makes bad governance go into a stage of just not being able to control it well and having liability along the way. We'll go through micro, macro, future, and regulatory lenses in the next few slides, moving all the way from metadata and architecture and business rules to cross-functional responsibilities and innovation and impact. Some basic principles, of course, for those that are newer to the data vault space, is that make sure that you don't get very creative, that you actually follow the instructions that are before you for the masters that have created this, and that merit that kind of adherence. And that even though, you know, the data vault artifact includes a record source, extract date, load date, etc., that gives you that data lineage, you still need to have that business lens to it to understand the why behind it. When we look at the advantages of a vault, incremental delivery, you can start small and incrementally add additional sources over time. My governance antenna goes up and says yes, and at which rate and for how long? So there could also be trouble when you don't guide that along the way. you need to have a game plan. If you're going to implement a vault and you have a lot of data coming in, especially if it's IoT related data, you need to understand where you're headed. It is likely that you get to the business unit and they may not understand themselves, or the data strategy may not be robust enough. But it is upon you then to create dependencies and risks and to call out the dangers if that strategy is not in place. Raw data is included. The recording of raw data in the data vault means it's possible to back populate the representation with historical attributes. This is beautiful. And if the data marts are implemented as views, this can be as simple as adding an additional existing view. Yes. Now, it doesn't mean that we relax just because we have this in place, because back to my records example, we can have great amounts of raw data with the chronicity there, but we're not supposed to keep it. And who gets to know that? Perhaps the business folks do not know that that raw data is there, those that are responsible for records, and it is possible that the data vault folks do not know that it's actually formally considered a record. So that can create trouble on both ends. Furthermore, lineage and audit as a data vault includes metadata identifying source systems. This makes it easier to support data lineage. Many of the organizations that are operating data vaults already have data catalogs in place. And from a governance perspective that is aimed to focus on that which is important and valuable, I would say the recommendation is to choose the place in which this lineage gets recorded in unison. It doesn't mean that it doesn't get recorded in several places, but take, for instance, the catalogs that allow for such lineage to be ingested, as well as manually added, whether it is dashboards that are non-traditional or artifacts or policies that are associated with that lineage. And make sure that you do have one story in one place so that you can have an auditor just go in and look at that one place and understand the why and the reasons behind what has been done. Otherwise, what happens is that you have a multiplicity of repositories and systems and vaults where auditors need to go in and try to connect what has happened. It is an exercise that needs to take place ahead of time. The possibility of automation, again, in the relationship modeling and dimensional design requires time and experience to build skills. So the ease of the data vault and the beauty of how it works architecturally is not at the expense of actually needing to become an expert in this. So there is a fair amount of sophistication. So from a governance perspective, what you would expect is that the guidelines and standards in place call out for an expectation that such training must happen. And that if you're about to deploy one, then keeping that in place and seeking funding for it at the same time would be a governance control in place that is useful. The learning curve, and then lots of joins, calling out that a poorly designed data vault would produce a massive number of source systems derived tables. This is more on the management side, but there are certain things like this that can be placed ahead of time in governance documentations that get used, not just that get put away after policy standards and guidelines get created to mitigate some of these issues. In regards to the data vaults and data science, the data scientists are consumers, of course, of this environment, and they produce refined data and information outcomes. And some of the recommendations that I see in terms of how they leverage the vault is the analysis of the scope of activities and what kind of insights they need to derive from it. Inquire as to the level of data quality, the threshold of tolerance. This is a piece that is important, and I did not see this in, and maybe I was just not always looking in all the right places, but I don't see this call out necessarily because when you are in the vault environment, that really is not, especially in the raw state, that is not something that you're particularly needing to worry about. Nevertheless, from a governance perspective, there should be a decision, a business decision as to what is allowed to come in raw state and what level, what is the score of that quality in whatever dimensions, however many dimensions you have the business has decided to utilize. So here's where the stewards come in: enterprise stewards, domain stewards, business stewards, more so than technical stewards. Why? Because the semantic aspect is the one that is really important here and hard to fix afterwards in terms of consistency, reasonability, validation, etc. The representational aspects are a lot easier to fix, but the semantic ones require that business and enterprise and domain expert to pitch in. So what is that level of tolerance that should be quantified and placed in the governance? And the roles and responsibilities accordingly afterwards. A bit more on data science. I borrowed this from Ro Lanvos and .com, and the poisoned data or infected data is not just bad data, but is it caused by drift? Is it caused by there's a myriad of reasons why this could happen. There needs to be more training, I believe, on both ends, those that are running a data vault, implementing a data vault, governing one, and those that are on the data science side as well, and selecting that methodology that will allow for these controls, these checks and balances, for understanding the uniqueness and the expected use, especially the expected use. Storing the business logic, the rules in a repository, back to having one central repository, even if there are duplications of that, that's all right. Why is that? If you look at the active metadata catalogs today, and you try to understand how the stewards go in there, and how sometimes even just overseers or product owners, if you're thinking of a data mesh, they go in and they talk about this metadata, they refine it, they curate it. And when they get to see that these rules are in place as well in the same environment, the questions come up, and the possibility of catching something that is stale is a lot higher. Taxonomy, I find that there is sometimes lack of use of proper standards, especially if they're worldwide standards and have been better for a long time. So when I go to organizations and they have what they believe is good standards, but they're not adhering to something that has been considered that worldwide, then the fear that I have is that they may not have a defensible posture in the eyes of regulators or in the eyes of litigation. When you are careful with that taxonomy and you're adhering per industry and per task to something that is either worldwide or US, NIST, let's say, although NIST is being used worldwide more and more, and ISOs have been worldwide for a long time, then there is now a more defensible position that you can have in terms of how you run your taxonomy. This is just a summary of what some folks do in catalog, modern catalog platform, and how you can use what you have in place for the vault. If you have it at a catalog, this example is Elation. I asked them, hey, give me an example of what your customers are doing right now with the vaults. And immediately they came back with, they're using it for lineage, to store lineage. They're using it for guiding users as to the most current information marks, especially if they're using Snowflake as well, since that gets ingested into Elation completely. Quality, whether it's 3 dimensions, 9 dimensions, 8 dimensions, depending on the standard that you're following, and the data discovery, guiding them to the places to use or not use anymore if they have been depreciated. This is a segue towards what is important in terms of the upcoming uses of architectural modalities, and I see more of the data mesh being used more and more. I know there are 2 camps. I know that folks love it or absolutely hate it, but conceptually, if you stay with me on the mesh, then what I see the vault for is such a fantastic candidate for sitting right there in the midst of that ability to aggregate and also have a measure of that federated computational governance in place, and being able to deploy that as it will. The principles of data mesh are, again, because of the agility that it affords, it requires quite a bit of maturity from the units producing the product of data. But if you're not seeing this already, the combination of the vault and the mesh concept, I think, is going to be coming around more and more. back to pure governance. This is a slide that when I use, people say, wait a second, what is this? I've never seen this order in place. Yes, this is not a reporting function. It is not a reporting order. It is merely where should governance get its guidance? So if you look at enterprise architecture, governance, and management, and its peer data management, as it rolls up, it ought to look at enterprise information governance. Not every organization has enterprise information governance. Most of the time, you're looking at data governance and enterprise architecture governance looking straight at IT. Actually, that is not the best place. IT governance is not, the audit comes that way, but it is not the best place for the governance of a vault, for instance, to get its marching orders. It should be that information governance gives a measure of that. And above that, it should be that governance, risk, and compliance, the operational aspect of it, is able to give you by industry and by existing findings and by strategic initiatives what that overarching governance should be. In turn, the GRC is supposed to look at enterprise risk management and see what is the board intending to do with information in the next couple of years that is going to be the currency for the organization. Are they going to move towards blockchain? Are they going to move towards more AI? Are they considering acquiring another organization? What is happening there with information that is going to affect how we deal with data and is absolutely going to affect how we architect that flow of data? And then above that, with the legal counsel on the side, understanding the laws, regulations by state, by country, by region, and corporate governance about that with COSO. So you will really get a framework of, at the very top, it will be COSO 2013 or 2017, let's say. At the ERM level, you would have an ISO 31000 that allows you to have a perfect process in place to report, identify, detect issues, even something like data drift. Then you would have at the GRC level a subset of that industry specific. And then as it comes down to data governance, then you have from the DAMA, of course, the DIMBOK, all the way to cloud and another frameworks in place that you could adopt. So hopefully this helps in terms of just understanding how it ought to be. Does this exist out there? Yes, it does. There are some very mature organizations that have that in place. Now, why is this important? And why is it important for the vault? I'd like to take you on a little bit of a tour of, I took this from Deloitte. This is 13 years of research and where tech is headed, or the trends that we see in place, and where we're going to see the vault play a critical role in the midst of these innovations. So I highlighted some of them applicable to today's talk: data sharing made easy, the human experience platforms, the bespoke of billions. But you get to see how we are moving at an extremely fast pace. If you look at this chart right here, you can either identify where your company is focusing on right now, or maybe where your clients are. And now you can begin to have a conversation that is more about unpacking and deconstructing how the vault plays a role in that space. I find that individuals that look at this say, you know what, we have been really focused on this right now, or we have been on digital twins for the last 3 years. We want to go heavy on AI, but we don't know how to compete well. And then that brings that governance conversation as well into play. Now, 47% of recently created data records have at least one critical work impacting error. Just a stat to bring to light that, and when I'm talking about records, I am talking about those that are officially called records. It is data, of course, but from a legal perspective. So why is this important? Because as you bring these into the vault, you need to have that understanding or that mitigation in place or that awareness as to the condition in which they come. How have they been created? Back to that fish analogy, where were they fishing and did they clean it at the right place at the right time? How did it arrive at the vault, and who is the one that is going to own, whether it's stewardship or ownership or enterprise domain expertise, to have that potential ratio of error decrease. So data sharing made easy, part of this Deloitte Trend Tech 2022. The report talks about sharing and thriving and monetizing the data assets, and that more than 70% of global data and analytics decision makers are expanding their ability to use external data. Do they wait until their data is good before joining it with us? No, we are rushing and we are juxtaposing and merging and aggregating and passing it through channels of further aggregation. And then we're also making decisions about people on this. So why is this important to the vault? You have the capacity, you have the luxury of being at the epicenter, if you will, and being able to ask a whole lot of questions about this sharing initiative, if it's happening in your enterprise or if it's happening with your clients. And through the vault, be able to put a lot of rigor in place and be able to mitigate some of the risks that come from this. At the same time, you can become the agent that, through the speed and agility that the vault affords, as well as the ability to mitigate some of the risk, that becomes a necessary factor and gains a seat at the table in more important conversations than just a back-end process. Privacy is at the core of what we do in Governed by Design, because we really care about the people inside of the data. And there's always people directly or indirectly affected by the data. I wanted to put in front of you something that most folks actually don't know, that is completely this way, unless you're accustomed to the GDPR, and the GDPR has brought much of it to fruition. But there are 8 types of privacy. And when I ask my clients, they're able to articulate 3 or 4, maybe 5, but they're not always sure about the rest. So obviously that the vault is going to bring in structured data, and we're not going to worry about some of these, but we need to know the impact and how it gets associated with links that are associated with the rest. Now, this is on the left-hand side, is more from a global perspective. On the right-hand side, we have interpretations of information, of privacy information that would appear to be, well, what is there a real difference between geolocation information defined between the states? Yes, there is. Keep in mind that more and more states are bringing up privacy laws, and that are not necessarily harmonized. There has been an effort to have that completed at a federal level. It does not mean that the state laws actually get preempted. So we have to have knowledge that we didn't have to have before at all levels of the life cycle of data. Why? Because privacy regulations now are demanding that in the entire life cycle, individuals are very aware, practitioners are very aware of how the data gets treated. So if we are in the vault, we have a lot of raw data. We have it not necessarily understanding what state the individuals associated with the data are coming from. Then we have some questions that we need to answer. Publicly available information is also a definition that is different between states. And I encourage you to go to this site that I've posted here. The folks from the law firm that do a great job in explaining that further. Even if you are just familiarizing yourself once a month on one particular law, it goes a long way in being able to put the right information in place in the vault, and being able to put the right structure for the metadata, so that these laws are honored as much as possible within that environment. Contextual privacy is a lot more complicated. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but please know that warehouses, vaults, environments that lend themselves to this aggregation, to business rules, much more so in terms of ultimate algorithmic work in ML and AI. Contextual privacy means that what you thought was absolutely fine in one criteria, in one context, is actually not so in another. And it is formulas that indicate what that context is like that can get people in trouble. It's very much a legal way of interpreting privacy. And I have worked in this space quite a bit to know that it confuses technology folks a lot. It's just so much effort that goes into trying to understand. Am I telling you be very, very careful with this? No, I'm telling you to just be aware and read a little bit more about it, as you will see more and more regulation coming in, getting to the back end. I'm going to show a slide on the audits coming up. There used to be assessments, but now they're more formally audits in terms of the AI work. And now they're looking right back at the capture level of the data. So not just at a vault level, but even at the capture itself. Hopefully I'm doing okay on time, but Mary will tell me otherwise. 6 privacy preserving techniques for sharing data and understanding how this some of this can be done in the vault and some of it cannot. But differential privacy, for instance, the noise that gets added, I know data scientists don't like that at all. And if you talk to many of them about synthetic data, they run away because they really cannot work with that. There is a balance that needs to take place in an organization, and nobody other than that organization can tell you what that balance ought to be, because they need to have a conversation with their legal counsel. They need to have a conversation with risk management and decide what is the risk that we're willing to get for the value that we wish to derive from the work being done in the data. And that's an equation. And that's not an easy equation to come to. What happens if you're working in an organization, you're a practitioner of data vault, and that equation is not in place, and you don't know what to push for, what not to, you don't know how to get there. Being aware of the governance that ought to be in there, called out to some degree, is important for you at least to be able to document it and say, we would like to put this in place, but we can't. And that is a good governance practice, that there were no controls for you to be able to mitigate against, but that you have it in the roadmap in the future with the right support, with the right adoption from the organization, that you can move forward in that. Just showing you the back end of all those privacy considerations in practice, and how simple, fairly simple laws like the GLBA can bring quite a bit of complication when it is in context. So again, not to distract too much from today's session, but just to know that there's a whole lot of beauty behind how those contextual considerations take place. Data governance meets legal. Back to how the vault is at the core, at the eye of this storm. There's 7 legal questions for data scientists today. On the right-hand side, I have placed the website. If you don't have I have the link at the bottom, where you can extract more information about what the FTC is asking for right now, the legal questions for data scientists, and how that affects the practitioners of warehouse and vaults and cloud, etc. The consent for use. So it behooves us in the data vault space to ask more questions about where is the consent, how healthy is, how fresh is that consent, according to which state or country or geographical continental laws. Do we have a legal basis for capturing that? That's very much a GDPR question. A legal basis really means, is it critical for our business to operate, to have that data? Or is it so important that we can defend that we must have that data and hold that data and not just a nice to have? So that legal basis is a profound, impactful way of knowing what we can and cannot have in a vault. Anonymization requirements, depending on the state and depending on the region, you would have different requirements for that. And then the retention ones that we spoke of, and then having the understanding that there are many laws that will just collide as to how long we should keep things. That's all right if the laws collide, but you need to have the assurance of the legal counsel that a decision has been made and that they thought it through. And that's a reasonable expectation from a governance perspective as to what can be held. The pipeline development work, I have this conversation quite a bit with third parties when they tell me that they're developing some APIs and they're helping in the pipeline work, and they're coming to a vault or a warehouse, and they tell me, you know, we are in good shape. We are ISO 27001 compliant, and we have a house in order. And I say, yes, that means you are securing the data. And they say, yes. I tell them, okay, I want to know how you're processing your own work. Walk me through how you have governance in place as you prepare, as you design, as you prepare, as you implement, and as you test. And then I show them this beautiful publication, is the NIST 800-218, that has to do with the SSTF. It came out not too long ago, and their eyes open wide and they say, oh, there's a whole lot more. Yes, there is. So this is becoming more and more the norm now. And I encourage you to just visit this and take a look because you want to make sure that you have your third parties do their due diligence and that you're not on the hook as a practitioner, having hired these folks that thought they were doing the right thing and it's just not quite right, it's not defensible enough in court. So are you ready? Now, do you want to share data with all of this in mind? And are you using Marketplace? Are you going to use Marketplace? Would you be a little bit more careful? My invitation is that you are. This is, however, a world in which we're steamrolling in terms of data sharing, and that is not going to stop. But we do want to be more literate and apply as much governance as we can in the right places. Such governance that cannot be applied right away needs to be documented and be part of a roadmap. And there needs to be more and more education as you go so that folks that are pushing for work more in the enterprise on AI and ML then become aware of this. By 2023, this is a statistic that I read at the end of last year, 65% of organizations worldwide will be using some form of AI platform and ML applications. So that is a given. So Data Vaults and AI. I found this at the Data Vaults Alliance site, which I thought was really neat. The Data Vault methodology is indeed focusing on the business objectives and goals so that its agility lends itself to that, which lends itself as a great candidate to be a predecessor for the AI work. The AI implementation is not always greenfield, and where we have the luxury of designing from scratch, we do, but that is not often the case. I was with a client not too long ago with data scientists. They were dealing with data marts and data scientists that were very concerned because a very, very well-known AI platform was getting implemented, and they just could not get to the bottom of how that algorithmic work was getting done. And it was fascinating because they were looking contractually to see how could they inquire further, but this was a very well-known platform that was just didn't need to tell them how it was done. So as the Vault lends data for the AI work, it has a measure of responsibility in such work. Just because it isn't being performed inside, it doesn't mean that it doesn't contribute to the problem. So as a Vault practitioner, owner, administrator, architect, keep this in mind and keep on asking these questions that are at the core of governance. There is a NIST publication for this as well. So our friends in NIST are catching up finally, and they are trying to break down what happens in terms of the biggest pain points in AI right now. And as far as the Vault is concerned, it would lie more in that statistical computational bias in terms of its contribution to it. But it is important to take a look at the other categories and see that it can happen from a human bias basis, individuals or groups, or just a systemic bias, or that less than elegant computational mechanism that needs to remain so fresh, and that is not always the case. More on that publication and understanding the breakdown, how it works with the data sets, the processes and the human factors, the reinforcement of equalities, and on that statistical and computational bias, that the using proxy variables is the one that can really get us into trouble. So when you are leveraging the Vault and you see that there is proxy work being done, then having some governance there in place goes a long way. And educating folks that are coming to the Vault to get that data is one way of making sure that there's a little bit of mitigation. And now being part, as Vault practitioners, being part of that pre-design and design and development stage as well. Why? Because the Vault is being leveraged for that work. More ISO, and this is human-centered design process. So back to, again, AI and how rigor and standards that are well vetted globally can be put in place at the pre-processing stage, at the in-process and post-processing. So if I were a lawyer coming to complain to your company that has been using AI incorrectly or has been making automated decisions incorrectly, and I want to trace back the steps of how that happened, I will go down to the pre-processing stage. And the pre-processing stage is likely where the vault or the environment would lend itself to being a candidate of not having been governed enough or not having enough diligence. 5 things that lawyers need to know. The lawyers are getting trained, quite trained, into what they need to understand and the questions they need to ask from architects, from business analysts, from developers, from IT leaders. So if you haven't heard of this already, know that it is coming to a theater near you, and that we will need to be much more equipped to help respond to legal inquiries about how the work that relates to AI and ML is handled. Let's talk a little bit about the tech stack going physical and the plethora, just the overwhelming amount of data that is hitting the smart devices. And by smart devices, I'm talking about not just the IoT, but the IOB, the Internet of Bodies, or the computational connectivity that is growing so much. So 2025, Deloitte tells us 30% of new industrial control systems will include analytics and AI age inference capabilities, up from less than 5% in 2021. So just in a few years, the growth is going to be tremendous. And does this mean that it's just sensor data, IoT data, not related to people? Not so. So much of this is directly or indirectly associated with privacy and with data sets that have individuals in them. So here we go with the onslaught of work that is coming just from this tech stack. So the devices, physical assets being regulated by federal, state, local restrictions, that is fine. Laws governing the devices themselves on the computational edge, but there isn't a whole lot in place in terms of governance and how that communicates and gets brought in to a vault. So the device may check out both the process as well as the technology, but not a whole lot coming back to the vault environment. And with the GDPR, there's more emphasis on that life cycle and data impact assessment. And this is where at the vault level, you may not have that lens of what exactly is this data going to be used for, what decisions are going to be made. Should I, as it is retrieved and as it is stored, should I actually have a sense of that? Yes, you should. If you're in an environment that is under the GDPR, then you should have a good understanding of where you fall within the DPIA and what the threshold of tolerance is from a legal perspective. I don't want to steal the thunder from security. I know that Michael is going to focus on that. But I do want to call out a little bit on the FTC. So the FTC folks have been for a couple of years quite awake in terms of how they are picking companies, small in some cases, that are in just leveraging AI, and they're asking a lot of questions, and they're picking them by industry, mid, small, large, and seeing how they are governing themselves. Now, the interesting thing is that in all of the cases that I read recently, it was the companies that were fined were companies that did not have a defensible posture. It's not that they were perfect and they had all the governance right at all levels, but they had thought through it. They had documented their roadmaps and desire to have this full life cycle of data and governed. And then they also had enough measures in place, process, not always tools, that allow them to get away with a good slap on the hand and then have that course corrected. The ones that simply bought tools and had no refreshing of governance or no good governance in place were the ones that got fined.
Paola?
Yes.
This is like a 4-minute warning, okay?
I will, thank you. I will just wrap this up now. So upcoming audits, up until recently, we did not have AI audits, we had AI assessments. as of January of this year. There's an organization called For Humanity Center, and the chair is a friend of mine. So now we have global formal audits in place that is going to educate probably all of us in this whole process. And let me just stop at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Paola. That was really a great presentation. We have a lot of excitement that's being generated, including we have some authors who are have joined the meeting, including Kent Graziano and Patrick Cuba are some couple of big names in Data Vault. So everyone seems to be very impressed with your knowledge. I really like what Tanya said. You make data governance easy. And, you know, this is also from Pavitra, what we carelessly use as demographic data in risk stratification algorithms has far-reaching consequences for the marginalized communities that are already disadvantaged to start with. So, and I know I've got a few questions just to kind of add to this. I mean, we all know the data governance should probably be done before you start your development, right?
It should be.
but we also know that doesn't always happen. So what advice do you have for individuals who might be on a team where they were gung-ho about Data Vault, started doing development, and now they're faced with all these data governance issues? What's the best way for them to get started?
Yeah, forgive yourself is quite all right. Most people are in that boat. I would say instead of going down the governance path that sounds so dry, focus on the business lineage and the business impact. If you're able to understand the story behind the data, you will move governance very far, or maturity very far, than if you start from a dry aspect of let's just apply regulatory and expected governance to this portion. That is not sustainable. People just don't care. But when you get to the bottom, have interviews with the enterprise stewards, so the business stewards, so multiple ones across domains. Tell me, how do we get this data? What do you use it for? What reports? Does the CEO actually make decisions on this? Does he make it to the board? Is it beginning to put those things in order allows you to then realize, wow, I thought I had a data set or a series of sources that ranked 7 out of 10. I actually have a 9.5 in terms of how I need to take care of this. And then you can start putting the appropriate governance that is allowed for that individual if the practitioner is not in the governance space, but inspiring to care about the decisions that are being made on the data goes a long way.
Yeah, and on that note, you know, especially in the public sector, you have governors who are using some of this data, and their reputations can be at stake as a result of it. I got another question for you, and there's always a debate about production data versus development data. And some organizations go through a lot of work to desensitize the data for development. Others put in rigorous security so they can use production data in development because it produces better outcomes with promotions. What's your philosophy on that?
Data is data. So I think that it has changed ever since the privacy regulations have kicked in as to how we treat even development data. Records, I mean, that is as old as digital itself. The development was always meant to be a practice ground, but not a playground. Right? So even the samples that are utilized, let's say, for development that is going to end up in exponential decision making, that can actually lead to really bad decisions. So you need to use very good data, high quality data. You can place it in a development environment, but it not to be that that data is not healthy. And so if you look at the very beginning, we looked at data as an asset, data as a product, and data as a service. If you look at your data always as a product and as a service instead of as an asset, then you will kick into the right governance gear, in my opinion, and have more care about it.
That's really wise advice. So, one last question for you. Talk about a little more about the data steward roles and how important they are to data governance.
Yeah, one of the things that I try to do right away is make sure that they get compensated accordingly and that they get their supervisors to allow them for the right amount of time per week to dedicate to this. But it is not something that gets granted unless those supervisors understand the value of the work, which brings us back to placing the stewardship work in what matters the most to that business unit. So going after every CDE that is in the master data management program, well, that is unsustainable. It has to be that it is constantly selling its purpose and its utility in that which is considered important today, and at the same time increasing the level of maturity to such an extent that it allows them to gain more ground, and that the stewards are so knowledgeable, are so literate in the data that they get the right reputation, and that they are asked more to participate at the requirements management phase, that they're asked to be part of architectural conversations. Otherwise, it needs to have, that needs to be designed well. You don't just create a committee and ask them to come and hope that everything is okay.
Yep, I can't tell you how many times I've looked at data from a development perspective, and the answer is, well, that was bad data entry, and they obviously didn't have a data steward looking at it. So just really emphasizing the importance again of data governance by design from Paola, Saibene, and Beanie, and we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us and sharing your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you.